Thanks for the introduction, Shipra, and hello, Miro community. I'm Hollis. I'm joining you all from Miro's Austin office, and I sit on Miro's platform team, collaborating closely with partners like the ones that will be joining us today. I joined Miro in the early days when we had just over 1 million users, and the notion of visual collaboration was just gaining traction. Now, 40 million users later, and a global revolution in the way that knowledge workers get work done, I am particularly excited to be able to close out Distributed with you all, accompanied by partners that have been true leaders in facilitating and changing the ways that teams connect, communicate, and work together. Over the last 2 days, we've heard a lot about building connection in the workplace and overcoming shared challenges facing teams around tool sprawl, knowledge silos, and spending time on work about work. So in today's roundtable, we will be joined by partnership leaders from Slack, Dropbox, and Miro to take a holistic view on the themes from Distributed and explore how all of the tools that we use mesh together to work more effectively. So with that, I'll introduce our roundtable. Joining us today are Steve Wood, Senior Vice President of Platform at Slack, Emma King, Director of Business Development at Dropbox, and Sanjana Tandon, Head of Strategic Partnerships at Miro. Hello, everyone. It's great to see you. Thanks for joining. Just to jump right in here, I'd love to hear from each of you and what the latest is with your company. So Emma, maybe you can start us off. Tell us about your role, what you've been working on, what you're excited about.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Well, to start, I'd like to actually talk a little bit about where we're coming from and kind of how that has brought us here now. So when I joined Dropbox 10 years ago, we had a chef cooking 3 meals a day at the office. We had a beautiful in-office gym, incredible interior design, and the company was really focused on how to make it a really nice place to spend your time. And when the pandemic hit, we saw an opportunity to sort of shift to this distributed work model and align not only our operations, but also our product strategy to virtual first. So we took kind of that same vigor that we had around having such a uniquely nice in-office experience and really directed that towards creating this distributed work model that prioritizes flexibility, because ultimately that's what employees want these days, flexibility with where they're working, the hours they're working, the tools they're using. And I am a new mother. I can attest to the value and the importance of that for me on gaining that flexibility in kind of maintaining the balance for myself. So leaning into this remote model ourselves, we're really able to truly empathize with our customers and users around what they need as a distributed worker. And tying this back to my role as an ecosystem leader, it's our job to make sure that as users are leaning into this flexible work, that we're not allowing there to be increased friction when their workflows are traversing multiple tools, because usually they are, right? Usually your workflows are leveraging at least a handful of different applications. We have an e-signature tool called Dropbox Sign. And if you have a salesperson using Dropbox Sign, they're able to send that contract or quote out for signature directly from their Salesforce account or their HubSpot account or their Freshsales account. And they're not uploading and downloading across multiple systems. And there are so many of these examples. It's across everything we do. So that's really what's on the horizon for me, and what I'm excited about is making sure that as we gain more and more flexibility, and as our employers give us that flexibility, we aren't seeing more friction in our choice of tools that we're so lucky to have.
That's great. Thanks. Well, thanks for joining us. Steve, if you'd like to chime in.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So, Slack. I suppose, so I've been at Slack for 2.5 years, I guess. I joined literally right at the beginning of the lockdown. So when I joined Slack, I joined entirely virtually. So I kind of welcomed my path into the company without all the cool office spaces and the nice interior design. So I totally lost out on all that benefit. I would say since joining Slack, we've been really uniquely challenged on what is the future of work. We'd actually really coincidentally started a thing called the Future Forum about like 6 months before the pandemic. which was looking at the future of work and how people would work in the new age. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden that became extremely relevant in terms of how people think about working. I mean, the big thing that we just keep hearing now, and then we heard through that the pandemic, is just employee experience has just become the core thing to figure out. And certainly as an employee joining in the pandemic and try to orient myself in this sort of virtual, or what we're calling the digital HQ, was quite challenging, because you don't have any of those ad hoc meetings where you're just, you're at the cafe, getting your latte, or you're down somewhere in your cool office space, just kind of soaking up the atmosphere. You're kind of, I sort of joke that I went from one company which was on Slack and Zoom to another company that was Slack and Zoom, and I'm still looking at talking heads that are, different faces, but it still looks very much the same. So how do you create a differentiated employee experience? And probably the biggest challenge for us was kind of similar to what you were saying, Emma, is like just trying to, a lot of work is happening in the tools, which is kind of sometimes outside of the purview of all of the teams. So driving that kind of cross-functional, cross-team alignment is quite difficult when there's all this work happening in all of these silos. So we started to see Slack as this fabric to bring these systems together so that you could see what was happening inside of, what's happening in Dropbox, like papers say, or what's happening on a Miro board. So what conversations are happening, not just inside of Slack, but outside of Slack, and what changes are happening in the systems, what things are being updated, just so you got that sense of just driving alignment across the team. But so it was just a weird kind of thing to kind of think, like, how do you figure out this space in a virtual environment? Like, how do you navigate this virtual space? Mm-hmm. So Slack, we have seen ourselves as that kind of digital HQ. So you'll see that we've worked a lot on a couple of things. One is we rebuilt and re-architected our platform. That was one thing that I led. That was actually why I was brought in. So, what a time to come in and sort of rebuild for this new age. But then we've also been looking a lot at like the binary between messaging and video just feels too harsh. So we were trying to occupy that middle ground of like, how do you kind of do the ad hoc, boiler, sort of water cooler conversations, or how do you just do something quickly, or just how do you make more opportunities for people to collaborate and get to know each other? So we've been really playing in that space quite a bit. There's still a lot more to do. But employee experience has definitely been the key thing that we hear consistently from customers, not just when we're going through the great resignation, but even now going to this hybrid environment. Like, how do you really nail that experience so people feel they can do their job well, they can manage their workflows, they know what's going on in all their tools, and they can collaborate effectively to move their stuff forward. So yeah, that's our take.
Great. And Sanjana, we can hear from
you.
Hi, Hollis.
Yeah. It's actually really fun to be here with people and companies I work with all the time. So for context, I lead strategic partnerships at Miro. I've been with the company for almost 2.5 years also. So also onboarded in somewhat isolated environment. But my role is really to identify and develop relationships with the companies that have the biggest potential for impact on our users and on our business. And specifically, I'm focused on building out our ecosystem of integrations. In the earlier keynote session, Varun spoke about Miro as a shared workspace to solve problems together, a place where Miro is your team hub and content is always up to date. And visions like this are made possible through partnerships, which is what I'm focused on. And I think what I'm personally excited to see is how Miro continues to be used in brand new contexts around the world. So we all lived through this huge cultural and professional shift in 2020, and now we're going through another one. But I think in this shift, it's a little bit less clear what paths individuals and their employers are going to take towards productivity and flexibility and balance. So I'm honestly curious to see how the world evolves from here and what we need to do as a product to support those paths. And in my time here at Miro, what's been amazing for me to see is how integrations are becoming more and more central to how we talk about the product and how we encourage customers to use it. So partnerships are going to be critical to the future of our strategy, and I'm excited that I get to play a role in that.
Well, thanks all. Steve, I wanted to focus on this term that you had used, which is Slack as a fabric. And I think what's really unique about Slack, Dropbox, and Miro is you're your perch sort of from which you've been able to view the changing ways and complex systems of collaboration across entire companies as three very horizontal tools. And so seeing not just specific workflows of a certain vertical or a certain team, but the connections of what does handoff of work look like from team to team, and really see those entire systems. So that said, I would love to hear a little bit more about, specifically Steve, what Slack has seen in terms of, over the last few years, trends with customers across different companies in terms of challenges and also changes in behaviors and modes of collaborating.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a lot. There's been a lot of change. I mean, I know everybody sort of experienced that kind of going into the office and the nice, well, hopefully nice offices environment that you had with your colleagues to this kind of completely remote work. And so I didn't want to, in some ways, the kind of everybody going in was an easy path to kind of managing your workflows and the flow of work through the organization. I mean, we used to design our office spaces so the people who needed to collaborate more would sit more closely together. So how do you do that digitally when you've got these horizontal digital spaces, kind of bring people who need affinity with each other closer together. And then I think there was this kind of period of everybody remote, which actually I think was also, relatively speaking, fairly not easy. We all had to move to a digital environment. I mean, I remember our CEO said, prior to the pandemic, 80% of our effort was figuring out our actual physical spaces that we could encourage collaboration and cross-working and that work flowing through the organization most effectively. And that completely switched to 80% of our time is spent just trying to figure out how to do the same in a digital world. And I don't think we still haven't totally nailed it. I think there's a lot of innovation still to do. But that was a big transformation that everybody had to go to. And IT had to go through that transformation, moving everybody into this sort of digital world. So is that, but I actually think that now what we're hearing from customers is this challenge of this hybrid working of just like, how do you, and I think actually that's probably the most challenging, even just as something as simple as like, are you going to actually be there or are you not actually going to be there? Because if you're actually going to be at this meeting, I'm going to need to go into the office if you expect me to be there too. Mm-hmm. But it's having some really interesting effects on, like, again, employee experience. Like, so we're seeing, so the Future Forum, we do a bunch of surveys across the industry. And one of the ones I thought was interesting is that those knowledge workers who are going into the office full time, it's like 34% of knowledge workers are going back in 5 days a week. Their employee experience and their employee scores are like plummeting. Like everybody's just like, it's just not working. Everybody's sort of reorientated to this more digital approach. Even candidly for myself, something as simple as when I'm working with my colleagues who actually have decided to go back into the office, they need more time to go between rooms, whereas I can just jump between meetings like super fast, like that physical, and they bump into people. So that whole world it's hard to marry those two worlds together. We're seeing customers who are uniquely challenged on, should we bring everybody back into the office? Should we do sort of part-time thing? And I think what we're hearing from our customers is that, and from the employees of those customers, is that the employees want flexibility in the amount of time that they need to be in the office, whether a lot or a little, if actually none, versus like location flexibility. Like, can I switch environments and go from one place to another? But we're definitely seeing a decline in employee experience at the moment. I think everybody's really grappling with how to improve it, particularly in this hybrid world that we're living in. So for us, I mean, we're obviously trying to improve that. A lot of, I think what we talk a lot about it at Slack. And Stuart actually has this little graphic of these bumper cars that are bumping into each other, which is a team that's misaligned. And if they all kind of start going in the same direction, then they can actually get somewhere as opposed to just bumping into each other. So we do see alignment as a key thing to get right in order to improve employee experience. If you can get stuff done, whereas an engineering manager might say nothing cures like shipping. It's kind of like when you get stuff out, you feel like you're doing productive work, then you feel like you're doing, that's a much better experience. But as we've talked about, when you've got all these tools and you're trying to link them all together. So we've been working on our platform side to make it easier to bring these tools together, become, as you say, that fabric of work. And the key area where we've actually focused our energies is not on like the data, which is actually something that funny enough, our parent company Salesforce is really good at, but actually what we call the events, which is like, what changed And who needs to know about that change? Like, did a new case just come in? Did a Miro board just get updated on a project that you need to think about? Like, was there a comment on it? Rather than having to like jump into all the tools and figure out which tool has which change, Slack can kind of tell you, hey, these are all the things that changed today. So you can see like, oh, a Dropbox paper was just created. Oh, somebody just added you in a comment. So just to know that that's happening and to be that fabric, that connective tissue, or we might even call it a central nervous system, just drives much, much better alignment. And if you can marry that with a collaboration, that you're there where the conversations are, and you can have a clip of like, that you can do asynchronously to say, hey, here's my update on what I think about that Miro board change. All that just helps drive the teams and move work forward. So that's the kind of stuff that we're seeing, I suppose, and the trends we're seeing.
Thanks. It's really interesting. On that, Emma, you had mentioned in your introduction just Dropbox's experience of undergoing its own virtual first strategy and implementing that, learning from that, and also now being a real leader in talking about what virtual first can look like for other companies. And so I'm curious to hear from you now that that's been implemented, and for other companies, it's hybrid work is mandates and returning to office mandates are now really in effect, and curious to know what challenges and gaps Dropbox still sees today now that you're really focused on in real time to solve for, now that you've had some time sitting and sort of.
Yeah, well, as Steve was talking, it made me start thinking about this trend we're seeing of people using more and more cloud content, and people are still using traditional file types, but we're also seeing people use Miro boards and Figma designs and Canva templates. And with these super powerful tools, folks are spending a ton of time searching for stuff. You are actually finding that your work is getting quite a bit more chaotic rather than less. And that's not an uncommon problem, I think, as you start to get more powerful tools and you get more fit for purpose tools, you end up having to figure out how to bridge the gaps between them. But also, like, did I save a bookmark to that thing? Did I copy a link to it and put it in a Google Doc? Did I save some kind of shortcut? And our user research team actually showed that a typical employee was spending 25% of their time looking for stuff and navigating between applications rather than just getting the job done. And so about a year ago, we acquired a company called Command E, and we're thinking a lot about how do we make it easier for users to organize and find all of their stuff, all of their content, and let them spend their time really focusing on the job at hand. So we see some really big opportunities in this space, and watch the space. I think there'll be cool things to come.
You three have a really unique point of view given your backgrounds in partnerships, and you're not just thinking about your own companies and products, but really constantly trained to think at the synapses of tools and how all apps and products that different teams are using within their workflows gel together, and how those can then work better together to help bring out the value of each tool and product for users. So Sanjana, I'm curious to get your perspective on that and what role you see partnerships, the platform, integrations that you're building with other companies playing and solving for these friction points and these trends that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, you described most of the role in your introduction, but right, our role is to take both a tops down and a bottoms up approach to understanding the usage of our product, both by itself and alongside other tools. So from the top down, we're trying to understand what are the most used and loved tools and how can Miro fit with them? How do we make you more efficient and more productive and stickier as a user? And you may have seen with the breadth of our integrations, we embed Miro into external tools, but we also bring tools back into Miro. And this is a strategic decision for us that recognizes that there are infinite uses of our product, right? We are a blank, infinite canvas. And so it's amazing to see all the different ways that people use us. And one of our core focus areas is trying to consolidate the work where you're doing it and design interactions that will prevent you from having to update multiple tools or cross-check multiple tabs to do what you need to do. And an example of bringing Miro into other tools is our integration with Slack, right? Which consolidates comments and gives you important information about what's happening on your Miro board without you having to constantly go back to Miro and get that information and get that context every time. Alternatively, we think about how to extend Miro into other tools. So one of the examples there is our integration with Dropbox Paper. So if you're writing a planning or a strategy doc, you can showcase what you need to from a Miro board within Dropbox Paper and not have to leave. And so what we're trying to do is encourage teams to build habits around how they best operate together and give them the flexibility to design that with our platform. And then from a bottoms up perspective, we want to empower the broader world of developers to build what they need to on our platform for their specific use case. We give them the tools, the documentation, and the support to build for anyone, including themselves. And ultimately, we see platform as enabling self-sufficiency and also letting others discover these solutions through it.
I'm curious to hear a little bit more, if you can also speak to this a bit, especially considering that I think Dropbox, as we think about bringing tools into our products and kind of spending time where users are doing their work versus making sure that for Dropbox, its files are available in the places that other teams and cross-functional teams are working. Curious to hear a little bit more about your perspective on that, of how Dropbox thinks about extending itself into other workflows and tooling.
Yeah, well, it's always been really vital for Dropbox to be integrated with users' primary applications, because we need to figure out how do we enable users to get the content into Dropbox and then back out of Dropbox. So into Dropbox from the tools where they're creating the content, and then out of Dropbox into the tools where they're using that content. So for the last 10 years, we've been working on making sure we are really well connected across an ecosystem of tools for creating and using content. But the thing I mentioned earlier about non-traditional content types, I think now we have this job to think about how do we do that for more than just those traditional files, and also how do we power more workflows with that content in Dropbox. I actually thought it was pretty fun that Sanjay and I used some examples of how Slack and Slack and Miro and Dropbox integrate, because the examples that came to mind for me were different integration points between our very own tools. So if you have a design team doing a brainstorm in Miro, they can pull in a file from Dropbox into the Miro board. Maybe they've kind of come to a conclusion of that brainstorm. They want to share out with their stakeholders. They could take a capture video, which is kind of a video communication tool that Dropbox has, of their kind of final Miro board to share updates with their team and stakeholders. They can send that through a Slack conversation, and within Slack, you have a rich preview of that capture video that you can watch right there in Slack. And so there are actually multiple touch points between each of our tools, and this is true across many other tools as well, to offer kind of back to that theme of flexibility of how you are connecting these tools.
Oftentimes, these can feel like top-down decisions that need to be made at a company, but I think it's also really important in the theme of distributed also, which is making space for human, for us to think about how us as individuals doing work every day can feel like we have the autonomy and the agency and the ability to really figure out for us what it means to do our work well, connect with our colleagues, and to be able to influence that on the ground. I think one challenge to that, though, is actually understanding, I'm experiencing cognitive load, from notifications or tool switching all day, or I'm feeling like I'm searching for information all day. I think oftentimes we can feel that, but it's really difficult to then identify the root cause of that and then how to implement change and actually to influence that. And so, Steve, if you could maybe start us off here on what advice you would have or how you would recommend we as everyday people can better diagnose what the root cause of issues that we're facing are in our workflows, and then actually the ways that we're implementing and using integrations and the tools that we have at hand to set up workflows that work for us as individuals.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair. I mean, actually, so I think you keep hearing the word workflow and that sort of stuff, and I think, and then there's obviously all the applications, and part of the reason why we rebuilt the Slack platform was to actually address the fact that I think the word that we've used a lot with employees is empowerment, which is we want to empower them to be able to use the applications the way that they do. So Emma, you said, oh, actually, when Sanjana was mentioning her example, you saw the tools working differently together. And I think that we hear that a lot from employees, is that the ways in which the tools work together varies really down to the individual employee. Sometimes it's the team, but look, I've been in the workflow business a long time. And like workflows that are that kind of top-down organizational thing are great. They're usually good for those big compliance processes where you've got risks or whatever. But when you try to think about like the human side of like, how do I actually work and how do I actually work with these tools? It's much more of a personal way of doing things. So we've been thinking like, how do we make it in Slack so that you can take these workflows that or these just ways in which you work that with these tools that are helpful to you to make sure that you're aware of what's going on and you can kind of build the automations that make sense to you. Actually, there was one interesting customer example that I was speaking to a Chilean bank. I can't actually name them, but basically they had transformed their banking systems to be real time. So everything was like, they have a huge data lake, so really centralized processes of like checking out for compliance risks or fraud alerts or stuff like that inside of their bank, or new loans being originated, this massive system. It was all very real time. And what happened during the pandemic was they were before they kind of handled it okay, but they'd really continued that transformation through the pandemic. And they were sending these notifications out like, hey, there's a compliance alert, or there's a new deal that's just been closed, there's a new loan that's just been originated, out to the teams, and they just had no ability to coordinate. And it actually caused them to have complete chaos on the front end. Their people couldn't take in the information fast enough because they didn't know how to act on it and what to do with it in that kind of silo of just a singular item of communication. So they actually moved over to Slack, obviously. And it was really interesting because all of a sudden they had the tools available to them, not just be able to know what things were happening, but the people around them to be able to collaborate with them, but also be able to create little automations that were just lightweight, just to help them manage it. So if a new fraud alert came in, one team member could actually, well, whenever that happens, I can just create a channel, and maybe add like a Miro board to collaborate, maybe like bring in paper or some files from Dropbox just to help me stay informed with what's going on. But those kind of little automations just make the work life much easier, much more kind of human to how you work. I think that kind of top-down automation, that kind of top-down transformation, I think we're good at that. We've been doing that for decades, candidly. I think it's now the time for this bottom-up empowerment and allowing employees to kind of customize how they work using the hundreds of apps that they're bringing into the office to help them do that more effectively. So that's kind of what we're saying, just kind of make work more the way you work as an individual, the way your teams work. And it is surprisingly different, as we've even just noticed on this phone call, like how different people work in different ways. So that's kind of what we're seeing.
When I think about Dropbox's shift to virtual first, there were a few primary things that we really needed to change culturally as a company. And one of the big shifts we made was what we call async by default. For anybody that's spent 8 hours in back-to-back Zoom meetings, that's not sustainable. And so we were trying to think, how do people end their days without a headache, right? How do people end their days not feeling drained? And we found that you really need meetings for debate, decision-making, and discussion, and everything else can pretty much be done asynchronously. And I'll say, with tools like Miro, you really can do those first three, the debate, decision-making, discussion, as well from across the globe as you can in the same room with, that combination of the video conference call and the collaboration tools. But this sort of triggered a major scale back on meetings. And we introduced this concept of core collaboration hours. There are 4 hours a day of overlapping time where people are expected to be available for calls, and they can, really schedule the rest of their day around their own needs, and kind of a flexible, like if you're a morning person and you're like, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to be finished working by 2 because I get such great work done at 5 a.m. Wonderful. That's great for you. You're online during your core collaboration hours. You're able to connect with people for those discussions, debates, and decision-making meetings. And then you get your work done outside of that. We actually even developed a tool called Dropbox Capture, which is a video communication tool with screen recording and markup. And we've found it be really successful with things like sharing updates, feedback, trainings, and people are able to spend 5 minutes on it instead of a half hour or full hour-long meeting, which they otherwise would have used. But I'll say in this effort to scale back on meetings, some of us realized I actually need that human connection. I actually want some meetings that are really just to build those relationships. And I imagine probably a lot of you have heard of Brene Brown. She says, we are hardwired to connect with others. It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. And without it, there is suffering. And it's really true. Without connection and relationships and trust, one, work is way less enjoyable, but also teams are less effective. So I think it comes down to each person making that decision for themselves of, really intentionally, what is the interplay between productivity and connection that I need? Because, we are human, and we, not only is the connection valuable for our well-being and happiness, but it also does impact how effective we are in our work.
Yeah, I think building off what Emma said, first of all, I definitely identified as one of those people who needed more interaction and more connection. And one of the reasons I moved from our LA hub to our Amsterdam hub myself was because I was craving that connection. And we have a pretty vibrant office here. And I personally felt like that's what I wanted. But I know that's not for everyone. And so I think to all the trends we've talked about, right? So many organizations today need to figure out how to support individual preferences, and that is not easy. And one of the things that I've just noticed over the last 2 years of this shift is the increasing need to kind of update information across all the tools we're using, all the channels we're in. We have the independence now in many cases to pick the tools, but we're suffering not only from information overload, but also information duplication across so many touch points. And I think part of what's driving that is us collectively learning, how do we build trust in a hybrid async world, right? What works for me personally in terms of connection versus productivity, but then also how do I translate that to something that other people understand and they relate to, but most importantly, that they can trust what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. And so I think while we're still experimenting through new processes and new behaviors, we're also feeling compelled to have everything everywhere instantaneously published and updated. And I think, we're just going to have to continue working through it so that we don't end the day drained and feeling like we've just been copy pasting information from, one tool into the next. So I think that's a challenge that we're still figuring out.
Great. Well, before we wrap up, I wanted to just look ahead. You three have a good pulse on the market. And so if there were one thing that each of you are really looking forward to in terms of innovations that are coming up that you think will really address some of these friction points and these challenges that are still facing teams today, what would those be? What are those?
Well, actually, I had two things. Actually, one was actually, as per Sanjana, I think it's really great that vendors are recognizing the need to work together and to bring the applications together. I think we're seeing a really healthy integration of everything you see here. Well, like us on the call here, but Dropbox and Miro, like just that working together is really critical because that's what the employees need to do too, to do their work. So I think that being reflected in the application space is great. But I also think, like, looking ahead, I think I think when it's back to that experience, but also that kind of getting in person and being more purposeful in that work. I think what I think a big mistake for an organization would be is to kind of just go back to, hey, the only way to kind of make that connection is just to be in person and kind of do the old thing again.
Mm-hmm.
I was at a customer meeting, for example, and it really was what I would describe, maybe grossly as a kind of a throw-up session of just like, just a complete download of just information. And I was like, we didn't need to get together in order to do this. But I think it's really interesting to see how companies will innovate in this hybrid world of like, when you get together, let's get together with purpose. Like, so for example, another customer of ours, they were getting together, the vendor and the customer were getting together to go for a run together, just to bring that closeness, maybe build that trust. They were all avid runners, and I thought, let's all run together rather than going to some, soul-crushing conference room to get, work through another presentation of something. It's like, let's get together and do things that are purposeful, meaningful, build trust, build collaboration. I think those meetings, just to get together for that sake, I think those will be the laggards of the industry who will rapidly be outpaced by those that are much more purposeful in how they bring that human element back into this sort of hybrid work that we're in today. So I'm very excited to see what we do there. That I think is going to be a key area of innovation.
I was thinking the same thing, like these walled gardens that we used to see really feel like things of the past. These days, well, if I look back several years, Dropbox felt like it had a unique advantage in being an open ecosystem. It was something that set us apart, actually. And maybe we've lost that advantage ourselves as a company, but it's good for everybody, right? It's good for everybody that any company you look at now has an ecosystem, a marketplace, an app center. So I fully agree with Steve. Looking forward, and I really don't know what this is going to look like, but I think generative AI is really fascinating, and there are really approachable, accessible applications of that, like DALL-E and very playful things. And then you also see really cool applications of it powering manufacturing and medicine. And I haven't seen as much of it yet in the future of work, and so I'm really excited to see how generative AI makes the way that we work better, more seamless, faster, and helps us focus on the areas where we can add unique value.
That's really interesting. I have also not really seen its application in productivity, so I'll be on the lookout. But I think for me, one of the more interesting developments is just the rise of kind of this low code, no code movement, which, I can see on platforms like Slack as well. I think the empowerment, to your earlier point, that I feel now as an end user, having access to basically any tool that I want, and then B, having the ability to actually get them to work in a way that I want together without being a developer is such a huge development, in the last couple of years. So I'm really excited to see what that does for the industry, but also just for me personally, because, that's a new capability that I have now that I didn't have a few years ago. So I think that's super interesting. And then I think in terms of this shift and this kind of debate that all companies are having around fully remote versus hybrid versus a full back to work, is that in all cases, I think one of the positive things coming out of it is there seems to be more of an emphasis on end results versus face time, right? And I think that goes to what you were saying, Steve, about the customer meeting. Like, what are we really trying to get out of it? And what's actually going to drive results? Is it sitting here and talking about, the data dump, or is it getting to know each other? Like, what is best going to help us reach the goal? And I think ultimately that focus on results versus how much time are you spending in meetings or in the office is empowering, and hopefully offers all of us more flexibility in the long run for a better work-life balance.
Okay, well, in our last minute or two, let's change up the pace really quickly and do some rapid fire. I'm just going to ask a question to each of you. So let's hear some just like pithy knee-jerk responses. So Emma, what is the work automation hack or integration that saves you the most time day to day?
It's so simple, but I love the Slack integration with Zoom where I can just kick off a meeting when I'm chatting and something ends up being a little more complex than I want to discuss via messaging and via chat. So that one I use probably every day.
Okay, I'll +1 that one. Sanjana, wired or retired, fake backgrounds on a video call?
Ooh, that's a good one. Honestly, I think a bit tired. At this point, I'm generally comfortable for most anyone to take in the world as it unfurls behind me. To be clear, this is not a fake background. I'm just using Miro's studio space, which is nicer than my usual background.
Okay, and Steve, what is the most out there future of work, innovation or trend that you're excited for?
Yeah, I don't know if it's sort of hugely out there, but I do think it'll be interesting to see like how location and presence become a core part of how we operate in a digital environment. I think we don't do it nearly enough innovation there to kind of help people understand where they are, like sort of spatially in both the digital and virtual worlds. So I think I'm really curious to see where hybrid takes us there to kind of understand like where people are and how they're working, that kind of stuff. I've seen some interesting innovations there, which I'd like to see more of. So.
I myself am looking forward to On Location is my avatar in VR office space. So anyway, with that, I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today. This has been a really insightful discussion, and I'm curious to see what the future holds for our partnerships together. And thank you, Miro community, for tuning in today and joining us. Before you close your browser tab, I'm going to hand you back over to Shipra to close things out here at Distributed. Thank you. Thanks all.
Thanks.
Thank you.